Welcome to the third episode of Climate on Air, discussing the future of EU climate policy. I'm Aaron Best, Senior Fellow at Ecologic Institute in Berlin.
And I'm Bradley Martzagala from the University of Eastern Finland's Center for Climate Change, Energy, and Environmental Law. Today we are discussing the infrastructure challenge, which is fundamental to meeting the EU's long-term climate goals, as well as other key EU objectives, such as ensuring security of energy supply.
Any publications mentioned during our conversation will be posted to our website, so be sure to check that out after the show.
In the previous episodes of Climate on Air, we have discussed what is transformative climate policy and identified 4 key challenges on the way towards transformation to climate neutrality. In episode 2, we discussed the innovation challenge, and today we focus on infrastructure.
We have 2 experts in infrastructure and climate policy in the studio with us, Katharina Umpfenbach from the German Energy Agency and Bettina Kampman from CE Delft. Katharina is director of the infrastructure unit at DENA, the German Energy Agency, and Bettina is manager of CE Delft's energy and fuels sector. She works on the interface between technology, policy, and economics. Katharina and Bettina, welcome to Climate on Air.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hi everyone, great to be here.
Before diving deeper into today's topic, I'd like to unpack the terminology a little bit. Let's start with your general view. What is infrastructure exactly?
Well, if I think of infrastructure, obviously one thing that comes to my mind is the word grid. We have a power grid, we have the gas grid, but we also have, locally at least, heating grids. And infrastructure is very much about grids, but they're not only about the cables and the pipelines, but also about everything else that we need to keep those grids stable. Converter stations, compressor stations in the gas net, things like that. And then the other element I think that's key that we have to keep in mind, the grid also needs to be connected to the appliances that then use the energy. And a key example here would be the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles.
Yeah, we thought about this in the 4i Traction project, and we took a somewhat more limited view. We understood infrastructure to be something that transfers something from A to B. Can be power grid, can be pipelines, but we also look at transport infrastructure, so road, railways, inland waterways. We did not include all the assets surrounding it, but of course they're all integrated.
So grids, connections, and transport from A to B, what a great starting point. And it certainly seems that infrastructure plays a key role in the transition to climate neutrality.
Yeah, thanks for giving us this overview, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to discuss the infrastructure challenge a little deeper today. So let's talk about how to approach infrastructure in the context of transformative climate policy. In our previous 2 episodes of Climate on Air, we established that there's still a lot to be done to reach climate neutrality by 2050. Our focus is on identifying solutions to move from incremental change, sort of the pace we're moving at now, to truly transformative change.
Indeed, Aaron. We already discussed briefly what is infrastructure. But why is infrastructure such an essential element of transformative climate change?
Well, I think infrastructure is really key to the transition from a society based on fossil fuels to one that's powered by renewable energy. So if the necessary infrastructure is not in place at the right time and location, the energy transition will be delayed. For example, just look at the power grid. When our energy system was based mostly on fossil energy, most of our electricity was produced in large coal and gas power plants, and there was a power grid in place to transport this from these plants to the end users, the households, companies, and so on. That is our current starting point. As we all know, we now move towards a system based on renewable energy, which is very different. Already now, we have a large number of locations where wind turbines and solar PV panels produce electricity, and some at larger scale, many at small scale, and those don't produce at constant levels or according to electricity demand, but they produce when there's wind and when the sun is shining. On the other hand, also, energy use will change. We see electric cars becoming mainstream. They replace petrol and diesel cars. We see heat pumps replacing gas-fueled heating. And this electrification will develop further in the coming decades, increasing electricity demand of households, industry, cars, trucks, everything really. So this all requires a very different power grid from what we have now. It needs to transmit much larger volumes of electricity than before when demand or production is high. And it connects different locations. In fact, we already see that the lack of infrastructure delays the transition in some regions. So here in the Netherlands, for example, some solar PV projects cannot be connected to the grid. It needs to be reinforced first, and that can take many years. Industry cannot electrify their processes due to limited grid capacity. And similar arguments can be made for other types of infrastructure, even for transport, of course. It may be effective climate policy to shift air travel to rail, but railway capacity is limited by the rails that are available.
Yeah, not surprisingly, I fully agree with Bettina. Infrastructure is absolutely key to all aspects of the energy transition, and if we don't have it in place in time, then we will not reach our goals. In addition to all the elements that Bettina already mentioned, I would just add a few other challenges. One is offshore grid. So we're building really a whole new infrastructure offshore, both for obviously wind turbines that need to be connected to the mainland grid, but in the future also that infrastructure might include hydrogen production offshore and the transport of hydrogen via offshore pipelines. And let me mention one other area that we touched upon but didn't go into any detail, that is heating and cooling. That is another area where all the scenarios for climate neutrality are showing us that we will have much more grid-based heating. So more households than today will be connected to a heat grid in the future.
You're both pointing at really dramatic change. I mean, we're talking about different types of energy, moving from fossil to renewable. We're talking about different volumes of energy with extra demand from electric cars, for example. And we're talking about, what I found quite interesting, also different places for energy. So that's a lot of change for the grid. So major changes are expected then. And how would you describe this future picture of infrastructure in a climate neutral EU? What would a good grid look like?
Well, I think one major qualitative change that we're seeing is that the infrastructure will be much more integrated than they are today. We will have what is often called sector coupling. So we will have technologies, or we're already starting to see technologies that connect especially the electricity sector with the previously separate system for transport and heating and cooling. The key technologies in this area are obviously heat pumps that electrify heating and electric vehicle. Both need power, and thus the power grid needs to be reinforced, but both also provide some flexibility for the power system to integrate variable renewables. And then the other key technologies are electrolyzers. Electrolyzers produce hydrogen from electricity. And then this hydrogen allows us to store energy much longer than we can with power, and also transport it in different ways. Here, the key element is that the electrolyzers need to be located where there is a lot of excess, for instance, wind energy or solar energy, so that they can also become a flexibility reserve for the power system. But then, of course, they also need to be connected via pipelines to those users that need the hydrogen, especially industry.
Yeah, I really agree with Katharina. In general, we need more and stronger power grids. We need a hydrogen grid, and we need coupling of all these grids, really. Yeah, a good grid should connect energy supply to the users of that energy. It should have sufficient capacity to ensure security of supply at all times and throughout the EU. It's worth mentioning. We need, I think, overcapacity rather than too little to make sure that the grid is resilient to any unforeseen events and developments. I mean, energy supply is really key to our economy. Yeah, we really need to have a good grid that works as well as the one based on fossil fuels that we have now.
I really like the idea of having good grids in our foreseeable future. So thank you both for setting the standard of what those should look like. So running with the idea of creating changes and how to get there, I'd like to shift more towards talking about the challenges and opportunities. There seems to be some serious challenges for the rollout of climate neutral infrastructure. Do you think that the current EU policies support such developments?
I think the EU's role in infrastructure rollout is at the moment quite hands-off. with most of the planning and decision making left to the member states and the network operators, national and local level. The EU does have a way used for coordinating, though, with a number of institutions where the regulators and network operators come together and discuss the way forward. So with this in mind, in our 4 Attraction project, we did a case study where we explored the possible benefits of a stronger EU role in the process to see if this can be improved. And we looked specifically at the planning and rollout of cross-border infrastructure. And that is quite key to the future energy system. Just to give a simple example, actually from this past Sunday, we had a lot of wind in the Netherlands, and electricity production was quite a bit higher than demand on that day. So much that even the prices were negative. You had to pay to feed in your electricity into the grid. And that makes a lot of sense to then transport the electricity to the other countries that do not have sufficient energy production on that day. Then these countries don't have to fire up their backup power plants, but rather use the Dutch renewable electricity at that time. So with this kind of interconnection, system works well on EU level. Energy system costs can be really reduced, and the energy transition can be sped up. Also, security of supply is increased, energy costs of consumers are reduced, and so on. So lots of benefits in this future renewable energy system. So we find in our case study that with an EU perspective on infrastructure planning, these cross-border benefits can be taken into account to their full extent. If you focus your planning only on regional or national level, you will miss out on some of these opportunities. And we developed a number of different policy options to achieve this, ranging from just some improvements to the current system to transferring all competences for transnational energy infrastructure to EU level. These are 2 extremes. I personally think the best option is in the middle of these. Strengthen the existing institutions at EU level where the network operators come together and give them more formal competences than they have now. But then the actual rollout and detailed decision-making would then remain in responsibility of individual TSOs. So we need to find a balance between these different levels, I think.
Here, I guess Bettina and I have a slightly different point of view, just because I am very much involved here at DENA in the national infrastructure planning. We are supporting our German climate ministry in designing what we call a system development strategy. So the idea is to create a common vision that then informs all of the different infrastructure planning processes for gas, power, hydrogen, and also heat grids as sort of a common guideline. And what we're seeing in this process, where we involve stakeholders and also consult with neighboring countries, is that already the national discussion is really complex, since it does involve a lot of different organizations. It has a big societal dimension. We have to integrate different governance levels from the national, the federal level in Germany down to the local level. And I cannot see that this process can happen anywhere else than at the national level. I cannot see all the competences going to Brussels. But I want to emphasize that, of course, interconnectors are absolutely key. So connections between countries. And here, that is, I think, where the EU has most value added in getting cooperation going between member states.
So, Katharina, you're focused, understandably, on getting the German solution going in this space. But the EU is the context. You mentioned interconnections. What can the EU do to help you in your work at the German level, and what also just benefit the EU generally?
Yes, I would say that cross-border infrastructure is really the main area where we need EU help. And I would say that the hydrogen grid that we are building from scratch is one of the areas where we need most help in general, and also with interconnection. So let me give you an example. For instance, in the Baltic region, there is a lot of hydrogen potential, or at least the Nordic countries, especially Finland, seeing a lot of potential to produce green hydrogen and then to transport it south to Germany, for instance, which will be a big importer of hydrogen. All the scenarios are showing this. Now, there are currently 2 corridors planned, one offshore through the Baltic Sea and one onshore through all the Baltic countries to Poland. Now, a big question is, will both of these projects be viable by 2030? Or will we need to prioritize? Because one key thing with these transboundary infrastructures is that they're only helpful if all the bits are actually built in the end. If there is a hole in the chain, then the whole corridor, the whole pipeline, or whatever it is, will not serve its purpose. So here I think the EU can play a key role in getting all the actors, the private investors, the grid operators, and the governments involved around one table and discuss the conditions for getting the whole pipeline built.
Yeah, these are good examples. And just to add, it is important to do that quite soon, sooner rather than later, because it typically takes many, many years to build new infrastructure projects. I mean, 5 to 10 years, certainly not uncommon. So the EU and the member states really have to look forward and anticipate what the energy system looks like in 10, 20, 30 years, which is really quite a challenge with all the uncertainties and all the developing technologies. I mean, we don't even have hydrogen grids, but we still need to plan a big rollout already now. And one other thing to mention there is that infrastructure is not technology neutral. If you build a hydrogen pipeline from A to B, you can only transport hydrogen through it and not power. So the infrastructure projects can also create a lock-in into a certain energy carrier. And decisions we take now can have quite a profound effect on how the future looks like. Yeah, I really like the idea that the EU can play a key role here. Just for one, because the EU's climate and energy policies are really a strong driver in the future energy supply and demand. We have quite some policies there, and infrastructure is really important to achieve this transition. So it's also really in the EU's interest to support the member state efforts to roll out this infrastructure that we need.
So in the same thread that we know that the decisions need to be made now, let's move right into how can policymakers steer this development of infrastructure. In the previous episode on innovation, we really heard and it was emphasized on how innovation always needs the necessary physical and regulatory infrastructure, which allows them to actually work in practice. How can policymakers ensure that infrastructure-related aspects are considered properly?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is that this infrastructure build out that we need for the climate neutral energy system requires enormous investments. And they will have to come mostly from private actors. But what we clearly need, especially in the hydrogen field, but also in some other areas, is some public support scheme. The hydrogen grid is particularly risky for investors because we built it completely from scratch. So we don't have producers yet, we don't have so-called off-takers, so the users yet, and we don't have the pipelines yet. So there's uncertainty all around. And what we need here is some commitment from the public side that these investments will work in the long term, will generate a return that can either work through direct grants or low-cost loans or to some more fancy models which ensure amortization at some point. The role the EU can play in this context is to ensure that their rules on state subsidies allow national governments to help. And in some cases, I guess we will have a few poorer member states that also need some direct EU funding to get the infrastructure in place that they will need for their climate neutral energy systems.
Yeah, I do think that policymakers are becoming increasingly aware of the role of climate neutral infrastructure, the key role it has in the whole transformation, the energy transition. But clearly more needs to be done at all levels. I do think it would be good to emphasize this more also on EU level through the European institutions such as the ENSOs and so the network operators and the Commission. I very much agree with Katharina that this cannot be left to the market and network operators alone. I also think all levels of governance need to be involved here. So EU coordination on the one side, on the national and regional level, spatial planning, permitting play a key role. And it all has to really fit together to get the developments going that we need.
So let's unpack the EU instrument toolbox here. What's exactly needed? What are the core instruments, in your view, that the EU needs to use and put in place to get this level of investment and coordination you're both talking about?
I think, first of all, we need really an integrated system analysis of the future EU energy system. We need to understand better what the energy flows will be and provide this information to policy makers on all the different levels. This can support them and the network operators in deciding on the infrastructure requirements for the future. Of course, this system analysis needs to be updated regularly. Our insights in the future energy system will develop further quite a bit in the coming years, but we have to start to get this process going.
I would add that the EU already has quite a toolbox. For instance, they have an instrument which they call the Project of Common Interest, PCIs. These are often infrastructure projects that cross borders, and the instrument consists in both a funding support and, I think even more importantly, a process where those projects are selected and where a lot of information on those projects is generated. And especially under uncertainty, where investors have to think, how will the whole chain develop? If I build this little piece, how will it connect to other elements in other member states? Information that can be generated is quite helpful. So I think PCIs are a key instrument. And again, I would underline what Bettina has said. Speeding up is key also in this process, as it is with planning procedures. We don't have the time anymore to go through several rounds, because in infrastructure terms, 2045 really is just around the corner.
Thank you both for such interesting points. And we've so far talked about what would be ideal scenarios, what we would like to see happen, what would successful infrastructure mean for Europe and nationally. But if we look forward, what does the future look like? What kind of approaches or actions on infrastructure can we expect?
Well, it's hard to predict the future, but we definitely need to speed up and we need to get starting. That's why at DENA we always argue for a relatively pragmatic view. Let's get going now, even if we haven't figured out the perfect exact final outcome. It's important to keep in mind that infrastructure is a lot of planning, and after that only you start with the actual building. So in a way, you have time to plan for different scenarios, and then what is important in my view is that you come back at times and look at the whole system, as we do, for instance, with the 10-year network development plan, and ask yourself, is this planning that I did still relevant today, or is it still the best solution with the knowledge I have today? So I would argue for let's get started, but let's review ourselves and let's be ready to adapt along the way.
Yes, of course, I fully agree that we have to speed up things. I also see that the recent EU policies, Fit for 55 and Repower EU, are really proving to be a very good driver to speed up the energy transition and transform energy production and demand. But they include only limited action on infrastructure, which is so strongly connected to these targets and actions. For example, the new Renewable Energy Directive sets a target for renewable hydrogen use in industry. And, well, clearly we need a green hydrogen infrastructure for that. So I do think it would be good to give more attention to infrastructure as a separate topic in this field. And more attention should be given to what was mentioned before, the permitting process, spatial planning. It's all really challenging to really find the space to physically build the infrastructure we need. And the third challenge that hasn't been mentioned is really manpower shortage. So much needs to be done, but where do we find the skilled manpower? We have quite some challenges and limiting factors, but these have to be resolved.
So we've been able to focus so far on both a national example in the case of Germany and also the broader EU level. But as we've all seen from recent world events, energy is a global challenge. It's an interlinked global economy that we're talking about. And Europe certainly is not isolated from other regions in terms of its connections in the energy area. So what about that global level? How do you see the EU actions and the remaining challenges related to what's going on internationally?
Well, I would say that last year, so 2022, has really been a lesson in vulnerability. And we should not forget that too quickly. My main takeaway from that year is that diversification is absolutely key, both with respect to the countries that we import energy from, as well as with respect to the energy carriers and the routes we're using. We need to build a robust system that has some slack and some redundancy, even if that's not the cost optimal path in the modeling. The modeling has perfect foresight, but we don't. And in the real world, this robustness has some real value. The second lesson for me from last year, the optimistic one, is that our integrated EU energy market was an absolute lifesaver. And our willingness to help one another in a crisis saved us last year. Let me give you an example. The gas pipelines to Norway and the willingness of Norway to increase production saved Germany from an actual physical lack of gas last winter. Now Germany is building LNG infrastructure terminals that are too large for what we need in our country alone, but they allow us to supply our eastern neighbors in case they face a supply shortage. And I think this spirit of solidarity in the EU and the spirit of robustness and some redundancy is what we need going forward.
Yes, I very much agree. A robust energy system is really the key. And in that context, I would like to mention stress the future need for imports of energy. The EU imports a lot of oil, gas, coal at the moment, of course, and I don't think we will be really self-sufficient in the future. We need to continue to cooperate with other countries, like the examples that Katharina just mentioned. That works really well. It also has to be set up now for the new energy carriers. For example, we need to create the infrastructure for the green hydrogen imports that I mentioned earlier, and the grid to transmit it further inland. This is a global challenge, and the EU should certainly also look at the broader context and the wider world when developing this.
There still seems to be a lot to tackle relating to infrastructure from the global level all the way down to the local level. So I'd like to ask both of you, what would your key messages to policymakers be? What should they focus on? And likewise, what should then citizens be letting their decision makers know? What should policymakers be listening to? What should their takeaway be?
Well, I think the first takeaway is quite clear. Speed up developments. Don't leave them for the future, but really get going. I also think, as I said, there's a need for EU-wide planning and EU-wide infrastructure strategy to maintain this resilient energy system throughout the EU. And that should not be an EU exercise in itself, of course. It has to be done at all levels. You need transnational strategy to distribution level and the district heating grid that were mentioned earlier. All this, have a strategy, and speed up the actual realization of that is really key to meeting the future climate goals, I think.
Yes, in a way, there's a trade-off, right? We have a world where infrastructure planning has gotten much more complex, especially through the interdependencies between different sectors, and taking investment decision has not become easier in a way. And at the same time, we have this really urgent need to get going. And I think the pragmatic solution is be aware of those synergies and interdependencies, but also don't overthink it, get starting. It's still a long process where we can readjust over time. And I think that's the key. We need to get starting, but we also need to be open to new insights over time and open to readjust previous decisions.
Well, our discussion has certainly brought some new perspectives to me about the need for speed, and also in the context of these big investments and imperfect information, and how to manage this flexibility that's needed and this coordination systemic approach. All very fascinating. Thank you, Katharina and Bettina, for joining us today on Climate on Air. It's been a great discussion, and good luck on building out our infrastructure on our path to climate neutrality.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you both. So, let's wrap up today's discussion. My 3 takeaways from today have been speed, coordination, and pragmatism. So speed, we have a need for speed. It's of the essence. Decisions and facilitation for changes needs to be supported today, and those decisions already need to be underway. Then I also found it super interesting that Bettina's case study really highlighted the need for cross-European coordination as well as down to the local level. It really seems that it should be so logical. If we were starting from nothing, and could rebuild starting from scratch, it would really make sense to have all these connections between the different grids and the communication to do so. But as Katharina pointed out, there's a lot of stakeholders involved for the system that we already have today. And that kind of brought me to the be pragmatic about infrastructure. It's an exciting time that we're in right now, and some of the new technology that we'll see later in our lifetime exists already, but we're not using it yet. And then I also had to reflect to episode 2 about innovation and how dynamic that is. And so some of the decisions that are being made today are also going to impact how that innovation comes to fruition.
Yeah, I think in all of our episodes, there's been an emphasis on moving fast. And, with infrastructure, that's a difficult thing to move fast was made very clear today. And so this need, like you say, Bradley, to move without having perfect foresight and, taking into account that this takes a long time to build, to move forward with pragmatism, very important. Also, grids, that was mentioned again and again, that we have different types of energy carriers. Hydrogen will play a more important role. We've got new volumes of energy with the electric cars, and then new locations of energy. So all those things are driving larger grids and in new places and of different types. I was really glad we had today someone from both the EU level and the member state level so that we could look into what's going on each of those levels and how they interact. So that need for planning support and investment support and process support from the EU was made very clear by Katharina, and the role it can play in terms of unlocking private investment. And then, of course, the last thing I'll mention is the energy security aspect, that this need for redundancy and capacity in the grid, and that's all very much fresh in our minds given the recent energy crisis in the EU.
Those are all really great points, Aaron. I absolutely agree. Next time, we'll be discussing another key challenge for transformative climate policy, namely investment. Keep an eye out for our next episode. Be sure to subscribe to our Climate on Air, Discussing the Future of EU Climate Policy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Deezer, Amazon Music, or Google Podcasts. Subscribe, review, and thanks for listening.
This podcast is part of the 4i Traction project, financed by the European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. For more information, check out our website at www.4itraction.eu.